My niece took me to update my will. The lawyer asked her to wait outside. My niece drove me 2 hours to a lawyer I'd never met to update a couple things in my will. She did all the talking, then the lawyer set down his pen. "Sir, I need to speak with you alone." He asked her to step outside. What he slid across the desk, I had never agreed to. "I'm truly grateful you're here with me right now, whoever you are, wherever you're watching from. Before this story starts to unfold in front of you, let me ask you something simple. Where are you watching from tonight? Tell me in the comments what town, what country you're listening from, whether you're winding down after a long day, driving somewhere quiet, or lying awake the way a lot of us do, once we've spent a lifetime trusting the family we thought would never turn a piece of paper into a weapon against us. Before we go on, leave me a comment. Just tell me where you're listening from. Which town, which country. One more thing before we really begin. Some details in this story have been fictionalized for the sake of clarity and emotional weight. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental. But the lesson you're about to hear, that part is real. As real as the smell of a barn at 5 in the morning, which is where I spent most of my working life. Now, let's begin. My name is Arthur Kessler. I'm 78 years old, and for 41 years I worked as a large animal veterinarian out of a small clinic just outside Kearney, Nebraska, driving out to farms at all hours to deliver calves, stitch up horses, and tell farmers things about their livestock they didn't always want to hear. I built a reputation across 3 counties for being thorough, for never rushing a diagnosis, for always checking my own first impression against the evidence twice before committing to a course of treatment. My hands, the same hands that once reached into a laboring cow at 3 in the morning without a second thought, never imagined they'd one day be shaking over a stack of legal paperwork, trying to understand how close I'd come to signing away everything I own to someone I'd trusted since she was a little girl riding along in my truck. Ruth. To understand the weight of what I'm about to tell you, I need to first tell you about Ruth, my wife, who passed away 9 years ago after a stroke took her from me almost overnight, without any of the long goodbye that some couples get and some don't. I met Ruth in the fall of 1968 at a county fair not far from where I grew up, back when I was a veterinary student, home for the summer, and she was working the concession stand her family ran every year at the fairgrounds. We married 2 years later, and for 47 years, we built a life together out of long hours, hard winters, and a small farmhouse just outside Kearney that we bought, with a loan I was still paying off well into my 50s. We never had children of our own, something that caused us both a private grief in our younger years, that softened over time into something closer to acceptance. What we did have was family close by, my younger brother Ray and his 2 kids, Denise and Danny, who practically grew up in and out of our house, riding along with me on farm calls when they were old enough to sit still in the truck, sitting at Ruth's kitchen table doing their homework, while their own parents worked long shifts at the meatpacking plant just outside town. Ray passed away 12 years ago, a heart attack that took him fast, the same way it seems to take so many men in this part of the country who work with their hands their whole lives. After that, Denise and Danny became, in a lot of ways, the closest thing to children Ruth and I ever had. And when Ruth passed 9 years later, it was Denise, more than anyone else, who stepped up to help me through those first terrible months, driving out from Grand Island most weekends to check on me, to make sure I was eating, to sit with me on the porch when the quiet of that empty house felt like more than I could bear alone. It's precisely because of those years of genuine kindness that what happened later cut so deep and took me so long to fully understand for what it actually was. The farmhouse and the practice. The farmhouse I still live in sits on 11 acres just west of Kearney, the same house Ruth and I bought together in 1971, back when the whole property cost less than some folks pay for a used truck today. I sold my veterinary practice 15 years ago to a younger vet who'd apprenticed under me for a decade. But I kept the house, kept the land, kept the old barn out, back where I still tinker with equipment I have no real business tinkering with anymore, at my age. Over the years, without children of my own, Ruth and I had done what a lot of folks in our position do. We made careful plans with an attorney about where everything would go once we were both gone. Our original estate plan, drawn up nearly 20 years ago with a lawyer I'd known since we were both young men starting out in this town, split things fairly between Denise and Danny, with a portion set aside for the Kearney Area Humane Society, an organization I'd volunteered with for decades, treating strays and helping place rescued animals in good homes long after I'd technically retired from paid veterinary work. Danny had always been quieter than his sister, less inclined to visit as often, partly because his own job as a long-haul trucker kept him on the road for weeks at a time. But he called regularly, and every time he passed anywhere near Kearney, he'd stop in for a night or two, help me with whatever needed fixing around the property, and never once asked me for a dime in all the years I'd known him as an adult. Denise, meanwhile, had built a small boutique clothing store in Grand Island, something she'd started with a modest loan about 6 years back, and she talked about it often during her visits, always with the same bright, confident optimism that made it easy to believe everything was going exactly as well as she said it was. I had no reason, at the time, to think otherwise, and every reason, given years of her genuine kindness toward Ruth and me, to trust her completely when she started talking, this past spring, about getting my paperwork in order. It started, as these things so often seem to start, with a conversation that sounded entirely reasonable at the time. Denise came by one Sunday afternoon in April, and over coffee at my kitchen table, she brought up the subject of my will, gently at first, the way you might bring up a topic you've clearly been thinking about for a while before finally saying it out loud. "Uncle Arthur," she said, "you're not getting any younger, and I know how much you hate dealing with paperwork. I found a lawyer over in Grand Island who specializes in estate planning for folks our age. Well, your age," she corrected herself with a small laugh. "And he's got a great reputation. I really think we should get your will updated properly. Make sure everything's exactly the way you want it before something happens and it's too late to fix any mistakes in the old paperwork." I told her I already had a will, drawn up years ago with Louise Bergman, the same attorney who'd handled legal matters for half the ranchers and farmers in this county for over 3 decades. "That old will's probably out of date, Uncle Arthur," Denise said. "Laws change, things need updating. This new attorney does this kind of work exclusively. He'll know exactly what needs fixing that Louise might have missed." I mentioned the conversation later that week to Walt Sorensen, a neighbor and old friend who'd farmed the land next to mine for as long as I could remember. A man I trusted about as much as I trusted anyone left in this world since Ruth passed. Walt and I share a pot of coffee most mornings on my porch, a habit we've kept up for years, weather permitting. "Arthur," Walt said, setting down his mug with a look I didn't fully understand at the time, "why would you need some brand new lawyer 2 hours away when Louise Bergman's known you and Ruth for 30 years and has your whole file sitting right there in her office in town? Seems like an awful lot of driving for something you could handle in 20 minutes right here at home." I didn't have a good answer for him that morning, and I confess I brushed off his concern more easily than I probably should have, telling myself that Denise was simply trying to be helpful, the same way she'd always been helpful, ever since she was a little girl, riding along beside me in that old veterinary truck. The drive to Grand Island. The appointment was set for a Tuesday morning in early May, and Denise picked me up herself, insisting there was no reason for me to drive 2 hours each way on my own, at my age, especially with my eyesight not being what it used to be for long highway stretches. I appreciated the gesture at the time, the same way I'd appreciated 100 small kindnesses from her over the years, never once suspecting there might be a different reason behind her insistence on being the one behind the wheel. The office of Attorney Gregory Combs sat in a modest strip of professional buildings on the edge of Grand Island, nothing like the small, familiar storefront where Louise Bergman had practiced for as long as I could remember. Denise had scheduled the appointment herself, spoken with the receptionist on the phone herself, and once we sat down across from Attorney Combs, a younger man in his 40s with an easy professional smile, it was Denise who did nearly all of the talking. "Uncle Arthur wants to simplify things," she told him. "Make sure everything's clear and up to date. He gets a little confused sometimes with all the legal language, so I've been helping him think through what he wants." I remember nodding along at various points, the way you nod along in a doctor's office when the conversation moves faster than you can quite follow, trusting that the people around the table understood my own wishes better in that moment than I trusted myself to articulate them clearly on my own. Attorney Combs took notes throughout, occasionally glancing toward me directly, though most of his questions seemed to route naturally toward Denise, who answered with the same confident, reassuring tone she'd used at my kitchen table weeks earlier. It was only near the end of that meeting, after nearly 45 minutes of discussion, that something shifted in the room. Attorney Combs set down his pen, looked at me directly for what felt like the first time in a while, and said, in a calm but noticeably different tone than he'd used up to that point, "Mr. Kessler, before we go any further, I need to speak with you alone for a few minutes. It's standard practice in cases like this." Then he turned to Denise and asked, politely but firmly, if she wouldn't mind stepping out to the waiting room for a little while. "I'm still here. Before I keep going with this story, I want to stop for a moment with you, whoever you are on the other side of the screen. I know what I'm about to tell you touches on something a lot of us carry quietly, especially those of us who've lost a spouse and leaned harder than we ever expected on the family members who stepped up to help fill that emptiness. If you've ever let someone else do the talking on your behalf because it felt easier, because you trusted them completely, because you didn't want to seem confused or difficult in front of a stranger, I want you to know that trusting them wasn't foolishness. It was love, plain and simple, and it deserves respect, not exploitation. I'm still here. Stay with me. If you're still here, on the other side of the screen, write it to me in the comments. I'm here. Because what Attorney Combs was about to show me, once Denise had stepped out of that room and the door clicked quietly shut behind her, was going to test not just my trust in my own niece, but my ability, at 78 years old, to understand exactly how close I'd come to signing away everything Ruth and I had spent a lifetime building together. What he slid across the desk. Once the door closed, Attorney Combs's whole manner changed, the polished professional smile replaced by something more careful, more direct. "Mr. Kessler," he said, "I want to ask you a few simple questions, just between the two of us, and I need you to answer honestly, because your answers matter a great deal for what happens next." He asked me plainly what I understood we were doing here today. I told him what Denise had told me, that we were updating my will, making sure everything was clear and current. He nodded slowly, then slid 2 documents across the desk toward me, tapping each one in turn. "This first document," he said, "is a new last will and testament, naming your niece, Denise Pruitt, as the sole beneficiary of your entire estate, revoking any previous wills, including whatever you may have had drawn up with another attorney. This second document is a general durable power of attorney, naming Denise as your agent, effective immediately upon signing, not upon any future incapacity, but right now, today, giving her legal authority over your bank accounts, your property, and your financial decisions, starting the moment you sign this page." I sat there for a long moment, staring down at pages full of legal language I hadn't fully absorbed during the meeting, feeling something cold settle into my stomach. "I never asked for any of that," I told him. "I thought we were just cleaning up some old paperwork. I never said anything about giving anybody control over my bank accounts while I'm still alive and well. And my nephew Danny, he's supposed to get half of everything, same as always. Nobody said anything to me about cutting him out completely, or leaving out the Humane Society either." Attorney Combs nodded, his expression grave. "Mr. Kessler, that's exactly why I asked to speak with you alone. In my experience, when one family member insists on scheduling and controlling every part of a legal meeting like this, and when the client himself seems unclear about the actual scope of what's being signed, it's often a sign that something isn't quite right. I'm not going to let you sign either of these documents today." The drive home. I don't remember exactly what I said to Denise when she came back into that office, only that I told her, in as calm a voice as I could manage, that I wasn't ready to sign anything that day, that I wanted more time to think it over. She seemed surprised, maybe even a little frustrated, though she covered it quickly with the same easy smile she always wore, telling me that was fine, that there was no rush, that we could always come back another time. The drive back to Kearney felt longer than the drive out had, 2 hours of highway passing in a tense, mostly silent stretch, broken only by Denise occasionally asking, in a tone that sounded almost too casual, what exactly Attorney Combs and I had talked about while she was in the waiting room. I told her, as evenly as I could, that he'd just gone over some standard questions with me, the same careful non-answer he'd advised me to give if she asked, until I had time to sort through what I actually wanted to do next. She dropped me off at the farmhouse a little before dinner, gave me a hug at the door the same way she always did, and told me to call her once I'd had time to think things over. I stood in my own kitchen for a long while after she drove off, staring at the same table where she'd first brought up getting my paperwork in order back in April, feeling a confusion and a grief I didn't fully have words for yet. I called Walt that same evening, and he came over within the hour, sitting with me at that kitchen table while I told him everything Attorney Combs had explained. The will naming Denise as sole beneficiary, the power of attorney giving her immediate control over my finances, all of it drafted without my full understanding of what I was actually agreeing to. "Arthur," Walt said, his voice low and serious, "you need to call Louise Bergman first thing tomorrow morning. Whatever's going on here, she's known you and Ruth for 30 years, and she'll know exactly how to help you sort through it properly, without anybody rushing you or doing your talking for you this time. Attorney Louise Bergman." I sat in Louise Bergman's familiar office the next morning, the same small storefront on Central Avenue where she'd handled every piece of legal business Ruth and I ever needed over 30 years, and told her everything, start to finish, watching her expression grow more concerned with every detail I added. She'd known both of us since before Denise and Danny were even born, and something about the disbelief on her face, mixed with a kind of professional recognition, told me she'd seen versions of this story before, even if never quite this close to home. "Arthur," she said, once I'd finished, "what you're describing has a name in my line of work. We call it undue influence, when someone in a position of trust manipulates an older adult into signing documents that primarily benefit that person, often isolating them from other advisors, controlling the flow of information, and doing the talking on their behalf, so the actual client's true wishes never really get expressed clearly. The fact that this Attorney Combs recognized the warning signs and insisted on speaking with you alone probably saved you from a legal mess that could have taken years to untangle." She pulled up my original estate file, the one she'd drawn up nearly 20 years earlier, confirming that it remained fully valid, still splitting my estate evenly between Denise and Danny, with a portion set aside for the Humane Society, exactly as Ruth and I had originally intended. "Nothing about this old will need it updating in any legitimate legal sense," she told me. "Whatever Denise told you about outdated laws or missing provisions simply isn't accurate. This was never really about improving your paperwork, Arthur. It was about replacing it entirely with something that benefited only her." I asked Louise what I should do next, torn between wanting to understand fully what Denise's intentions really were and wanting, somewhere in the back of my mind, to believe there might still be an innocent explanation I hadn't considered. "Before you do anything else," Louise told me, "I want you to check with your bank. Given what you've described, I want to make absolutely certain nothing has already happened with your accounts that you're not yet aware of." That single suggestion, delivered so calmly across her desk, sent a fresh wave of dread through me that I hadn't fully anticipated until she said it out loud. What the bank told me. I drove straight from Louise's office to First Nebraska Trust Bank, the same branch where I'd kept my accounts since before Ruth and I were even married, and asked to speak with the branch manager, a careful, thorough woman named Patricia Yoon, who pulled up my account history while I sat across from her, my stomach tight with an anxiety I hadn't felt in longer than I could remember. "Mr. Kessler," she said, after several minutes reviewing something on her screen, her expression shifting into something more guarded. "I need to ask you something directly. Did you authorize a visit to this branch back in March by a woman claiming to hold power of attorney on your behalf?" I told her, my voice tight, that I had never granted anyone power of attorney, and that I hadn't been to that branch myself since sometime the previous winter. Patricia turned her screen toward me, showing a note logged by a teller back in March, describing a visit from a woman who had presented herself as my niece and attempted to inquire about my account balances, and to request that her name be added as an authorized signer using a document that, according to the teller's notes, appeared incomplete and lacked proper notarization. "Our policy requires a properly executed and verified power of attorney document before we can add anyone to an existing account," Patricia explained. "The teller who handled that visit followed protocol and declined the request, but she did document it in your file, precisely because something about the situation struck her as irregular enough to flag for future reference." I sat in that small bank office, feeling the full weight of this discovery settle over me. Whatever Denise had been planning, she hadn't started with that meeting in Grand Island back in May. She'd already made an attempt, months earlier, using some kind of incomplete document, quietly trying to gain access to my finances long before she ever mentioned updating my paperwork to me directly. calling Adult Protective Services. Louise Bergman advised me to file a report with both the local police and Nebraska's Adult Protective Services, explaining that what had happened at that bank, combined with the attempted will and power of attorney at Attorney Combs's office, represented a documented pattern of attempted financial exploitation, even though, technically, no money had actually changed hands yet. I was assigned a caseworker, Grace Liu, a patient and thorough woman who came out to the farmhouse herself to interview me, along with Walt, who I had asked to be present for support. "Mr. Kessler," she told me, "what you're describing is exactly the kind of case our office exists to investigate. A pattern of behavior designed to gain financial control over an older adult before any actual theft occurs, which means we have an opportunity here to intervene before real damage is done, rather than after." Grace explained that Nebraska law recognizes financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult as a serious offense, one that doesn't require money to have actually disappeared, only clear evidence of an attempt to gain unauthorized control through deception or undue influence. She worked closely with Detective Mike Sandoval from the Kearney Police Department, who opened a formal investigation, requesting records from both the bank and Attorney Combs's office to establish a clear timeline of Denise's actions over the preceding months. "Mr. Kessler," Detective Sandoval told me during our first meeting, "cases like this, involving a family member rather than a stranger, are some of the hardest for victims to report, because so much of what happened can look, on the surface, like simple family assistance rather than criminal intent. The fact that you have documentation from both the bank and the attorney's office showing a deliberate, escalating pattern makes this case considerably stronger than most we see." Sitting in my own kitchen, listening to a detective and a caseworker describe my niece's actions in the careful clinical language of criminal investigation, I felt a grief that went far deeper than the money or property at stake. I was grieving more than anything, the version of Denise I thought I'd known my whole life, the little girl who used to ride shotgun in my veterinary truck, now revealed as someone capable of calculating, deliberate deception against the very uncle who'd helped raise her. What was really happening with the boutique? As Detective Sandoval's investigation progressed, a much darker picture began to emerge behind Denise's confident talk about her boutique clothing store, one that helped explain, though never excuse, the desperation apparently driving her actions. Through financial records obtained with proper authorization, investigators discovered that Denise's store had been steadily failing for nearly 2 years, drowning under a combination of declining foot traffic, a business loan she'd taken out to expand into online sales that never generated the returns she'd projected, and a growing pile of unpaid invoices to suppliers who were threatening legal action of their own. Behind the bright, optimistic updates she'd shared with me during her visits, Denise had actually been quietly liquidating her own retirement savings for over a year, trying to keep the business afloat long enough, she apparently believed, to turn things around. "She was drowning, Mr. Kessler," Detective Sandoval told me, laying out a timeline of her mounting debts alongside the timeline of her actions toward me. "The March visit to your bank happened right around the same time her business loan payment went into default for the first time. The push to update your will and get power of attorney in May came just weeks after her supplier in Omaha filed a formal collections notice against her. It became clear that Denise hadn't set out, at least not at the very beginning, with some cold, calculated plan to defraud me. It appeared instead that a business failure she was too proud and too frightened to admit to anyone in the family had gradually pushed her toward increasingly desperate measures, each one a little more serious than the last, until an attempted bank visit with an incomplete document escalated into an attempt to secure full legal control over my entire estate. That understanding didn't erase my anger, or the grief of watching someone I loved choose deception over honesty, but it did give me a fuller picture of the desperation that had apparently been building behind her bright smile for far longer than I'd ever suspected, hidden carefully enough that even Walt, who saw plenty of the county's business through his own farming connections, had never caught wind of just how bad things had gotten for her. Confronting Denise before charges were formally filed, Detective Sandoval allowed me the chance to speak with Denise myself, one last time, though he cautioned me carefully about what I should and shouldn't say, given the ongoing investigation. I asked her to come out to the farmhouse on a Saturday afternoon, and she arrived looking tense in a way I'd never quite seen from her before. The easy confidence she always carried noticeably absent. "Denise," I said, once we were seated at the same kitchen table where this whole thing had started back in April. "I know about the bank in March. I know about your business, the debts, the collections notice from your supplier. I need you to tell me the truth about what you were really trying to do with that will and that power of attorney." I watched her face crumble in a way that reminded me, painfully, of how she used to cry as a little girl whenever she'd broken something and been caught before she could hide the evidence. "Uncle Arthur," she said, her voice shaking. "The store was failing, and I didn't know how to tell anyone. I thought if I could just get access to some of your accounts, just temporarily, I could keep things running long enough to turn it around. And then I'd put everything back exactly the way it was, and nobody would ever have to know how close I came to losing everything." "And the will?" I asked her, my own voice steadier than I expected it to be. "Cutting out Danny, cutting out the Humane Society Ruth and I always wanted to support." She looked down at her hands, unable to meet my eyes. "I told myself I'd fix it eventually, once the business was stable again. I told myself Danny didn't need the money as much as I did, since he's never had the kind of debt I'm dealing with. I know now how wrong that was. I know I should have just asked you for help honestly, instead of doing all of this behind your back." I sat with that confession for a long moment, feeling the particular grief of watching someone you helped raise admit to a calculated, sustained deception, rather than a single moment of weakness. "Denise," I told her finally, "the fact that you were struggling isn't the crime here. The crime is everything you did to hide that struggle from me, and everything you tried to take from me instead of simply telling me the truth. Danny finds out." Telling Danny what his sister had attempted was, in its own way, almost as painful as confronting Denise herself, because I knew it would force him to reckon with a version of his sister he'd never had reason to suspect existed, the two of them having always been close despite the physical distance his trucking job kept between them. I called him during one of his stops, somewhere in Kansas according to the background noise on the line, and told him everything as plainly as I could manage. There was a long silence on the other end before he finally spoke. "Uncle Arthur, are you sure? Denise has always been the one who checks in on you the most. This doesn't sound like her at all." I told him about the bank visit in March, the meeting in Grand Island, the will naming her sole beneficiary, the power of attorney that would have given her immediate control over everything I owned. I could hear him processing it, piece by piece, the same way I imagine most people process a betrayal too large to absorb all at once. "I need to hear it from her directly," he said finally, and a few days later, once Denise had confirmed everything through her own attorney, Danny called me back, his voice heavy with a grief that mirrored my own. "I keep thinking about all those visits, Uncle Arthur. All those times she told me how well the store was doing, how she was thinking about opening a second location. I had no idea any of it was falling apart. I had no idea she'd do something like this instead of just telling me, telling either of us that she needed help. She was ashamed, Danny," I told him, as gently as I could. "A shame does strange things to people, makes them choose secrecy over honesty, even with the people who love them most. That doesn't make it okay," he said. And I agreed with him completely, even as I recognized, in both our voices, the same complicated mixture of anger and grief that comes from discovering someone you love is capable of a betrayal you never saw coming. Charges are filed, based on the evidence gathered by Detective Sandoval. The bank's documented note about the incomplete power of attorney presented in March, Attorney Combs's own account of the meeting in May, and Denise's admission during our kitchen table conversation, later repeated to investigators with her own attorney present. The Buffalo County Attorney's Office filed charges against Denise for attempted financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult under Nebraska law, along with a related charge tied to the incomplete and improperly represented document she'd presented at the bank back in March. Assistant County Attorney Renee Castellano, who was assigned to prosecute the case, met with me twice in the weeks before the preliminary hearing, walking me through what to expect. "Mr. Kessler," she told me, "cases involving a family member as the accused are always emotionally complicated, and I understand you may feel pulled in different directions about how hard to push this. But the evidence here, an attempted bank transaction followed months later by an attempt to secure a will and immediate power of attorney without your full understanding of what was being signed, shows a clear, sustained pattern rather than a single moment of poor judgment. She explained that Denise's lack of any prior criminal record, along with her voluntary cooperation once confronted, would likely factor into sentencing recommendations, but that the county still intended to pursue the case seriously, given how deliberately she'd worked to keep me from having independent legal counsel review what she was actually asking me to sign. It's going to feel slow, and at times, it will feel like the process cares more about procedure than about you, Castellano warned me. But the documentation you already have, Patricia Yoon's banknotes, Attorney Combs's account of that meeting, your own memory of exactly what was said, that's precisely what makes this case strong enough to hold up, instead of falling apart the way so many family exploitation cases do when there isn't a clear paper trail. The hearing. The preliminary hearing took place at the Buffalo County Courthouse in Kearney on a warm morning in early autumn, the kind of day that would have been perfect for working cattle if the circumstances bringing me downtown had been anything other than what they were. I sat beside Louise Bergman, with Walt in the row behind me for support, while across the aisle Denise sat with her own defense attorney, her posture rigid in a way that reminded me, painfully, of how nervous she used to look as a teenager whenever she thought she was in trouble. Assistant County Attorney Castellano presented the evidence methodically. Patricia Yoon's documented account of the March bank visit, Attorney Combs's written statement describing the May meeting, and his decision to speak with me privately, and a summary of Denise's own admission during our kitchen table conversation, confirmed independently through her cooperation with investigators. The judge, a measured, unhurried man named Judge Harlan Whitcomb, listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on the papers in front of him. Denise's attorney didn't attempt to dispute the underlying facts, focusing instead on her lack of any prior record, her voluntary cooperation once confronted, and the financial desperation documented through her failing business records, arguing that these factors warranted leniency alongside any criminal accountability rather than harsh punishment as an end in itself. Judge Whitcomb found sufficient evidence to move the case forward, setting conditions for her release that included a prohibition on any further contact with my financial accounts or legal paperwork, and a requirement that she seek financial counseling as a condition of her continued release pending trial. Watching my own niece stand there while those conditions were read aloud, I felt the same complicated mixture I imagine most families in this situation feel: grief for what had been lost, and something almost like relief that the truth, finally, was being named clearly and openly, instead of continuing to hide behind her carefully maintained confidence. The hardest doubt. Before I agreed to fully cooperate with the charges filed against Denise, I spent several days in an inner turmoil that, even now, I consider among the most difficult stretches of this entire ordeal, perhaps even harder than the moment I first understood what those documents in Attorney Combs' office actually contained. Because discovering someone tried to deceive you is one thing, deciding deliberately to put your own niece through a criminal trial, knowing it could follow her for years, is something else entirely. I spent long nights on my porch, staring out at the same fields Ruth and I had watched together for nearly 5 decades, asking myself whether it wouldn't be wiser, more dignified even, to simply let the matter drop, to accept what had almost happened as a painful but bearable warning, without dragging Denise through a court system that could shadow her for the rest of her life. I thought about Danny, about how this might strain the bond between brother and sister that had survived so much already. I thought, with an irrational guilt that gnawed at me in the darkest hours of the night, about what I might have done differently as an uncle to prevent Denise from ever arriving at this decision in the first place. It was Walt, once again, who gave me the perspective I needed during those difficult days. "Arthur," he told me one evening, setting his coffee mug down, with a deliberate care that told me he'd been thinking about what to say for a while, "if we let this go, what exactly are we teaching Denise? That she can keep doing this, maybe with even worse consequences down the road, maybe even against Danny himself one day, if he ever has something she decides she needs. Justice isn't revenge, Arthur. It's the natural consequence of a choice your niece made as a fully grown, responsible adult, not some innocent lapse in judgment." I also spoke with Louise Bergman about this turmoil, and she offered me a sentence that stayed with me long afterward. "Arthur, forgiveness and justice aren't in conflict with each other. You can forgive Denise in your heart for your own sake, and still insist that she face the legal consequences of what she attempted. Sometimes real accountability is the only path that can actually help someone understand, fully and completely, the gravity of what they've done. It was with those words held close to my heart, more than any desire for punishment, that I finally decided to move forward with full cooperation in the case against Denise. Understanding that whatever path I chose, pain for this family was already unavoidable, but determined that pain would not be meaningless, that it would carry some greater purpose for all of our futures, including Denise's own. The trial. The trial began nearly 7 months after that morning in Attorney Combs's office, held in the same Buffalo County courthouse where the preliminary hearing had taken place, though this time the atmosphere felt heavier, more permanent, the way any trial does. Once everyone in the room understands the outcome will carry lasting consequences. Assistant County Attorney Castellano built her case over 2.5 days of testimony, walking the jury through the same documentation she'd shown me months earlier. Patricia Yoon's bank records from March, Attorney Combs's account of the meeting in May, and the financial records establishing Denise's mounting business debts as the likely motive behind her escalating actions. I testified for nearly an hour and a half, describing 47 years of marriage to Ruth, the family we'd built with Denise and Danny standing in for the children we never had, and the particular pain of discovering that the same niece who'd ridden shotgun in my veterinary truck as a little girl had tried to secure control over everything I owned, while carefully keeping me from understanding what I was actually being asked to sign. When Castellano asked how I felt once I understood the full scope of what had happened, I answered with words a local paper later quoted, "I spent 41 years learning to read the signs an animal gives you before it tells you plainly something's wrong. I never imagined I'd need that same careful attention with my own niece, sitting right across my own kitchen table." Attorney Combs himself testified about his decision to speak with me alone, explaining to the jury the standard practice among estate planning attorneys of watching for warning signs of undue influence, a family member controlling the conversation, scheduling and driving the client to an unfamiliar attorney, answering questions on the client's behalf rather than allowing him to speak for himself. The jury deliberated for just over 5 hours before returning a verdict. I remember sitting beside Walt in the gallery, my hands folded tightly in my lap, waiting to hear whether months of careful documentation and quiet, determined persistence had finally been recognized for exactly what they represented. Waiting for the jury. There is a particular kind of silence that fills a courthouse hallway while a jury deliberates, and I don't think anything in my 41 years of careful, methodical veterinary work ever quite prepared me for how long 5 hours can stretch when everything you've documented, everything you've fought for since that morning in Attorney Combs's office, hangs in the balance of 12 strangers' judgment. Walt and I sat together on a hard wooden bench outside the courtroom, drinking bad vending machine coffee that neither of us actually wanted, making the kind of small, distracted conversation people make when they're both trying not to think too hard about what's happening behind a closed door just a few feet away. Danny paced the hallway in slow, restless circles, occasionally stopping to check his phone, though there was nothing on it that could have told him anything useful about what the jury was deciding. At one point, Louise Bergman came to sit with us, and I asked her, somewhat foolishly I suppose, whether the length of the deliberation meant anything about which way the verdict might go. She smiled gently and told me what she had apparently told countless other anxious clients over the years. "Arthur, jury deliberation length rarely predicts the outcome the way people assume it does. Sometimes a long deliberation means they're being thorough. Sometimes it means they're divided. There's no way to know until they walk back in that room," I thought, sitting on that hard bench, about all the years I'd spent trusting careful observation, precisely because it gave clear, unambiguous answers, unlike people, unlike juries, unlike nieces who could smile at you across a kitchen table while quietly planning to take everything you'd built. There was something profoundly uncomfortable about surrendering control over an outcome this important to 12 people I'd never met, who had spent only 2.5 days getting to know the facts of a betrayal that had upended my entire family's life. When the bailiff finally called us back into the courtroom, my heart pounded harder than it had in years, and I gripped Walt's shoulder so tightly I worried, briefly, that I might be hurting him, though he never once complained or asked me to loosen my grip. The verdict. Denise was found guilty of attempted financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, along with the related charge tied to the incomplete document she'd presented at the bank back in March. Given her lack of any prior criminal record, her voluntary cooperation once confronted, and the underlying financial desperation documented through her failing business, Judge Whitcomb sentenced her to 2 years of probation, mandatory financial counseling, 100 hours of community service, and an order permanently barring her from ever serving as my agent under any power of attorney or as a beneficiary under any future will unless I myself chose, freely and independently, to reinstate her at some later date. When Judge Whitcomb read the sentence aloud, I didn't feel the satisfaction I might have expected. I felt instead a quiet, complicated grief. The grief of a man watching the niece he helped raise formally held accountable by the state for a betrayal that had started, I believe, not from malice, but from a shame she hadn't known how to carry any other way. Denise turned to look at me as the courtroom began to empty, and for the first time since that Saturday afternoon at my kitchen table, I saw something in her face that looked less like fear of consequences and more like genuine, unguarded remorse. We didn't speak that day. Her attorney had advised against it, given the ongoing terms of her probation still being finalized. But that single look told me something I needed to hold on to in the difficult months that followed, that whatever else had broken between us, some part of the girl I'd helped raise was still in there, finally facing what she'd done instead of hiding from it. Danny, sitting beside me throughout the trial, exhaled slowly when the verdict was read, and afterward, in the hallway outside the courtroom, he took my hand and said the only thing either of us really needed to say in that moment: "Thank you for not letting this destroy what's left of our family, Uncle Arthur. Thank you for making her face it instead of just letting it quietly disappear." Community service. As part of her sentence, Denise was required to complete 100 hours of community service, and the court, taking into account both her background in retail management and the nature of her offense, assigned her to volunteer with a local nonprofit that provides financial literacy classes to low-income families and elderly residents across Hall County, working under close supervision of licensed volunteer coordinators. Danny told me, during one of our regular phone calls, that Denise had approached this assignment with a seriousness that surprised even him, arriving early to every session, staying late to help participants who needed extra time and patience, treating every single class with a level of careful attention that, in a strange and painful irony, mirrored the exact kind of diligence she'd deliberately abandoned when she tried to secure control over my estate months earlier. "She told me once," Danny said, his voice quiet, "that every time she helps someone understand how to protect their own finances from exactly the kind of manipulation she once considered using against you, she thinks about what she almost did, and it keeps her honest in a way that nothing else quite manages to do." I didn't know, hearing that, whether to feel comforted or simply sad, imagining my own niece using the memory of her attempted betrayal as a kind of daily penance, a discipline she'd apparently needed all along, but had never found until the criminal justice system forced it upon her. I asked Danny, cautiously, whether he thought this assignment was genuinely helping her, or whether it was simply another performance meant to demonstrate remorse to a judge and a probation officer. "I think it started that way," he admitted honestly, as something she had to do to satisfy the court. "But somewhere along the way, I think it became something she actually needed, a way of proving to herself, more than to anyone watching, that she could still be the kind of person who helps rather than harms." I've thought about his words often since that conversation, wondering whether genuine change can grow out of a punishment that begins as pure obligation, and whether, given enough time and enough consistency, that kind of forced accountability might eventually become something closer to real, lasting character. Danny's own reckoning. In the months following the trial, I watched Danny go through his own private reckoning, separate from mine, though intertwined with it in ways neither of us fully anticipated. Danny had spent years on the road, missing most of the ordinary family moments that come with staying in one place, and this particular crisis, one involving his own sister, tested him in ways his solitary trucking life had never quite prepared him for. He started calling me more often during those months, sometimes just to talk through his own confusion about how to feel toward Denise, sometimes simply to check that I was doing all right on my own, out at the farmhouse. "Uncle Arthur," he told me one evening, his voice tired after a long haul somewhere through Colorado, "I keep asking myself what I missed. Should I have called her more? Should I have noticed something was wrong with the business sooner, instead of just believing whatever she told me? I told him, as gently and as honestly as I could, that the same shame that had driven Denise to hide her business troubles from both of us had also, quite deliberately, been designed to hide itself from a brother's watchful eye, even one who called regularly and genuinely cared. "Danny," I said, "you didn't fail her by trusting her word. That shame she was hiding is proof she knew exactly how far she'd strayed from what your family raised her to be. It's proof she understood right from wrong well enough to feel that shame in the first place." He was quiet for a long moment after that, and I could hear, even over the noise of his truck's engine in the background, something in his breathing settle just slightly. Over time, Danny worked through his own complicated grief about his sister, separating his affection for her from any need to excuse what she'd done, a distinction I watched him slowly, painfully learn to hold on to, even on the hardest days when old family loyalty threatened to blur the line between forgiveness and denial. Watching Danny fight his way toward a steadier understanding of what had happened, even while our whole family navigated the practical and emotional wreckage Denise had left behind, became one of the quiet sources of pride that helped carry me through my own hardest months. 41 years on call. To understand just how deeply Denise's betrayal cut, I have to go back much further than this past year, back to 1969, when I finished veterinary school and came home to Kearney to start my own large animal practice, driving out to farms across 3 counties at every hour of the day and night, delivering calves, setting broken bones, and learning over decades of work to read the smallest signs of trouble in an animal long before it became obvious to anyone else. That work taught me a particular kind of patience and attentiveness that I carried into every other part of my life, including, I always believed, my relationships with the people I loved most. You learn, treating livestock for 4 decades, that the animal in front of you can't tell you directly what's wrong, that you have to watch closely, ask the right questions of the farmer standing beside you, and never simply accept the first explanation offered without checking it against what your own eyes and your own careful judgment are telling you. Ruth used to tease me, gently, about how I approached even our own household decisions with that same diagnostic caution, wanting to examine every angle of a problem before committing to a solution. "Arthur," she'd say laughing, "not everything in life needs a full physical exam before you make a decision." But that same instinct, the instinct to look carefully before accepting a comfortable explanation, is exactly what should have kicked in the moment Denise insisted on driving me 2 hours to a lawyer I'd never met, and exactly what I regret more than almost anything else in this whole ordeal, not trusting more fully in that first crucial moment. Denise and Danny grew up watching that same instinct in me, riding along on farm calls, watching me examine a sick animal from every angle before committing to a diagnosis. And it's precisely because of that shared history that discovering Denise's calculated deception felt like such a profound violation, not just of my trust, but of every lesson about careful, honest attention I thought I'd successfully modeled for both of them across their entire childhoods. The kids I helped raise. I want to spend some time telling you about Denise and Danny as children before any of this happened, because understanding who they were to me makes clear just how deep this betrayal cut, deeper than any piece of property could ever measure on its own. After my brother Ray and his wife both took jobs at the meatpacking plant to keep their family afloat, working shifts that often left them exhausted and stretched thin, Ruth and I started picking up the slack in ways that felt entirely natural to us at the time. Denise, the older of the two, used to ride along with me on farm calls starting around age 7, sitting quietly in the passenger seat of my old veterinary truck, asking 100 questions about every animal we visited, fascinated by the mechanics of how a cow's stomach worked, or why a horse needed its teeth checked. Danny, 2 years younger, was quieter, more content to stay back at the farmhouse with Ruth, helping her in the garden or working through whatever school project needed a second pair of hands. Both kids spent countless weekends at our place growing up, treating our farmhouse almost as a second home, a place where Ruth always had something baking, and I always had some small task that needed an extra set of hands. Denise, in particular, developed a genuine head for numbers as she got older, helping Ruth balance the household budget some evenings, the same way I imagine she later balanced the books for her own boutique. I remember being proud watching her grow into a confident young businesswoman, never once suspecting that same confidence could someday be turned toward hiding a business failure rather than confronting it honestly. Uncle Arthur, she told me once, maybe 16 years old at the time, sitting in my truck after a farm call, I want to run my own business someday, just like you did. I laughed at the time, charmed by her ambition, never imagining that the same girl who dreamed of running an honest business would one day use everything she'd learned about careful planning to construct a scheme against the very uncle who had helped shape those ambitions in the first place. It's precisely because those years of genuine connection actually happened, because the girl I remembered really did exist, that discovering what she'd become capable of doing wounded me so much more deeply than a betrayal from any stranger ever could have. How I met Ruth. I want to spend some more time telling you about how Ruth and I found each other, because understanding that love makes clear why losing even a piece of what we built together all those years later cut so much deeper than any property dispute ever could. It was the Buffalo County Fair, the summer of 1968, and I was home from veterinary school, helping my father with the cattle he still kept on our family's place outside town. Ruth was working the concession stand her family ran every single year at that fair, and I remember walking past that stand 3 separate times before I finally worked up the nerve to actually buy something and start a conversation with her, even though I wasn't especially hungry any of those 3 times. We married 2 years later, in the spring of 1970, in a small church not far from the fairgrounds where we'd first met, and we spent our honeymoon doing something that still makes people laugh when I tell them, helping her father get his cattle through a difficult calving season. Since I was already the closest thing to a veterinarian the family had access to, even before I'd officially finished my schooling, Ruth managed the finances for my practice for years, keeping the books with a precision that would have made any accountant proud. And even after her stroke, in her final conscious days, one of the last things she said to me was about making sure Denise and Danny were both taken care of fairly, the way we'd always planned. "You'll do right by both of them, Arthur," she told me, her speech already slurred, but her meaning perfectly clear. "You always do right by the ones who need you." I've thought about those words more times than I can count since discovering what Denise attempted, wondering, with a grief I can't quite untangle from the anger, whether Ruth's confidence in me, in all of us, would have survived seeing what her own niece was capable of doing. Ruth's final days. I want to dedicate a little more time to Ruth's final days, because understanding that grief helps explain, by contrast, just how deeply it hurt to discover that Denise had tried to use the exact document that was supposed to protect what Ruth and I built together as a tool to take it all for herself instead. The stroke happened on an ordinary Tuesday morning, 9 years ago, while Ruth was making coffee in the same kitchen where I now sit writing these words. There was no lingering illness, no long goodbye, just a sudden collapse and an ambulance ride to the hospital in Kearney, where doctors worked for hours before finally telling me the damage was too extensive to reverse. She lived 4 more days in that hospital, drifting in and out of consciousness, and in the brief windows when she could speak clearly, she spent much of that precious, limited time talking about Denise and Danny, about how proud she was of the young woman Denise had become, running her own business, and the steady, hard-working man Danny had grown into, driving trucks across half the country to support himself honestly. "Promise me you'll keep them close, Arthur," she told me, one of the last coherent things she ever said to me, her hand gripping mine, with whatever strength she had left. "They're the closest thing to children we ever had. Don't let them drift away from you once I'm gone." I promised her I wouldn't, without any idea, in that moment, how literally I'd end up needing to keep that promise years later. Not simply by staying close to Denise, but by having to hold her accountable, in the most painful way imaginable, for a betrayal that struck directly at the values Ruth had spent her entire life trying to instill in both of her niece and nephew. Walt's story. I wanted to understand more fully why Walt had reacted so quickly with concern when I first told him about the trip to Grand Island, because I sensed there was a story behind his caution, something more than just general suspicion of a 2-hour drive to an unfamiliar lawyer. One evening, over coffee on my porch, he finally told me the whole of it. Walt's own late wife had a sister whose son, years before Walt and his wife ever met, had convinced their elderly mother to add him to her farmland deed just to make things simpler for the family, a phrase eerily similar to the one Denise had used with me. Within a few years, that mother had discovered the nephew had already begun negotiating to sell a portion of the land to a neighboring farmer, without ever informing her or the rest of the family, planning to split the proceeds quietly before anyone else realized what had happened. "She caught it in time, Arthur," Walt told me, his voice carrying an old, familiar grief, but only because a neighbor happened to mention the sale to her directly, thinking she already knew about it. If that neighbor hadn't said anything, she'd have lost half her family's land without ever understanding what had actually happened until the paperwork was already final. It was that story, told to him decades earlier by his own wife, that made Walt so immediately alert when I first mentioned Denise's insistence on a new lawyer 2 hours away. "I recognized the shape of it right away, Arthur," he said. "The reasonable-sounding explanation, the insistence on handling all the details herself, the resistance to involving anyone who actually knew you and could ask the right questions. I couldn't watch that happen to you without at least saying something, even if it turned out to be nothing." His words and his own family's painful history gave me a deeper appreciation for just how much luck, as much as caution, had been on my side. The luck of an attorney experienced enough to recognize the warning signs, and a friend willing to voice his concern even when I initially brushed it aside. Talking to my old practice partner. Around the time I began working with Detective Sandoval, I found myself thinking often about Dr. Roy Fenwick, the younger veterinarian who had apprenticed under me for a decade before I sold him the practice 15 years ago, a man who had learned most of what he knew about careful diagnostic patients directly from watching me work. I hadn't spoken to him in a couple of years, but something about this whole ordeal made me want to hear his voice again, to tell him what had happened, and perhaps selfishly, to hear him tell me I hadn't been foolish to trust my own niece the way I had. I called him one evening, and he remembered our old routines immediately, his voice as steady and measured as it had always been, even now running the practice on his own for over a decade. I told him the whole story, start to finish, and he listened without interrupting, the same patient way he used to listen to my case notes back when he was a nervous young associate trying to explain a diagnosis he wasn't quite confident about yet. "Arthur," he said once I'd finished, "you taught me that the animal in front of you never lies, but the story you're told about that animal sometimes does. You taught me to look past whatever explanation the farmer offers first, and check the actual signs myself before committing to anything. You did exactly that here. You didn't just accept Denise's version of events, you followed the actual evidence, even when it broke your heart to see where it led." His words gave me a kind of comfort I hadn't expected, a validation not just of my actions during this difficult ordeal, but of an entire career's worth of discipline that had, in the end, protected me precisely when it mattered most. "You should be proud of how you handled this," he told me before we said goodbye. Even though I know pride is a strange thing to feel about something this painful, but there's no shame in having helped raise a niece who eventually strayed. The shame belongs entirely to her and to the choice she made, not to you and not to the decades of honest work that shaped the man you've always been. I hung up the phone that evening, feeling for the first time in months that the discipline of my entire working life hadn't just protected my finances, but had somehow also protected a piece of my own sense of self, exactly when Denise's betrayal had threatened to shake it loose entirely. Other cases Detective Sandoval had seen. During his investigation, Detective Sandoval mentioned that Denise's scheme, while deeply painful to me personally, wasn't an isolated case in this part of Nebraska, a fact that helped me understand just how widespread this particular vulnerability had become for older adults across rural communities like ours. In one case from a couple of years earlier, an elderly widower out near Lexington had been convinced by his own son-in-law to sign a quitclaim deed transferring his farmhouse and surrounding acreage temporarily for tax purposes, only to discover nearly a year later, when a property tax bill arrived, addressed to someone else entirely, that the transfer had been permanent and irreversible under state law, since he'd signed the document without consulting an independent attorney first. In another case, involving a woman in her 80s from a small town outside Grand Island, a grandson had convinced her to make him a co-signer on her checking account to help with the bills, only to gradually siphon off her savings over nearly 2 years, small enough amounts each month to avoid triggering any bank fraud alerts, but devastating in total by the time a suspicious neighbor finally encouraged her to check her balance directly with the bank. What connects all these cases, Detective Sandoval told me during one of our later meetings, is the same basic vulnerability: an older adult trusting someone close to them enough to skip the independent verification that would normally catch a problem before it becomes serious. You caught this in time, Mr. Kessler, partly through luck and partly through your own instincts, but plenty of folks in this county haven't been so fortunate. That knowledge, the awareness that my own case represented just one example of a much larger and more troubling pattern playing out across ordinary families throughout rural Nebraska, strengthened my resolve to see the case through to its conclusion, even through the moments when the emotional cost of doing so felt almost unbearable. And even more so, my resolve to speak publicly about what had happened, so that other families might recognize the same warning signs before it was too late for them. The town finds out. I never sought attention for any of this, having spent 41 years in a profession built around quiet, practical problem solving out in barns and pastures, far from anything resembling public attention. But once the trial concluded, a reporter from the local paper picked up the story, and for a while, my private grief became a matter of public record in a way I hadn't fully prepared myself for. The first article ran under a headline that still gives me an odd feeling whenever I think back on it. Kearney veterinarian's niece convicted after attempted estate scheme. Case highlights growing pattern of elder financial abuse. Within a week, the story had been picked up by a regional television station out of Grand Island, and I started receiving phone calls from reporters wanting to interview me, to put a face and a voice to what they kept calling the will scam. I turned down almost all of those requests, not out of pride, but because I felt this story belonged to more than just me. It belonged to Walt's wife's family, whose land had nearly been sold out from under an elderly mother decades earlier, and to the widower out near Lexington, whose farmhouse had been permanently transferred through a misunderstood quitclaim deed, and to every other older adult across this state who might, at that very moment, be sitting across a kitchen table from a family member, insisting they just needed to update a couple things. I did agree to speak with one reporter, a patient man named Doug Hensley, who had covered elder financial exploitation cases for years, and who wrote a longer piece focused less on me personally and more on the broader pattern, interviewing elder law attorneys, adult protective services caseworkers, and rural community advocates about how common this kind of family-perpetrated fraud had become across small towns like ours, and what warning signs families should watch for. After that article ran, I started receiving letters and messages from people across several states who'd experienced something similar. A man in Kansas whose son had convinced him to sign over a family ranch using a document he never fully understood. A woman in South Dakota whose niece had opened a credit card in her name after helping her apply for a Medicare supplement. I answered as many of those letters personally as I could manage, sharing the same advice I now repeat like a mantra to anyone who will listen. Never let anyone else schedule your legal appointments, do your talking for you, or drive you somewhere you've never been to see a lawyer you've never met. If it feels rushed, or if you don't fully understand what you're signing, stop and ask an independent attorney to look at it first. The letters that kept coming. In the months following Doug Hensley's article and the regional television coverage of the case, letters and emails kept arriving, more than I ever expected from a single newspaper story, each one carrying its own version of the same painful family betrayal, filtered through 100 different circumstances, but always following that same recognizable shape. One letter came from a retired school teacher in North Platte, describing how her nephew had convinced her to add him as a joint owner on her savings account, just in case anything happens to you, only for her to discover, nearly 2 years later, that he had been slowly draining that account to cover debts of his own from a failed side business. A story so similar to mine that I had to read her letter twice to remind myself it wasn't somehow describing my own situation back to me. Another letter, this one from a retired farmer in rural Kansas, described how his granddaughter had convinced him to sign over power of attorney, temporarily, just to help manage the bills while you recover from surgery, only for that granddaughter to use the authority to take out a loan against his small savings. A loan the elderly man hadn't discovered until collectors started calling his home directly, months after the fact. I answered as many of those letters personally as I could manage, sometimes late into the evening at my kitchen table, sharing the same advice that had become almost a second nature to me by that point. Verify everything independently. Keep detailed records of every conversation and every document, and never let gratitude for someone's help silence the small, nagging voice that tells you something doesn't quite add up. Several of those letter writers later reached out again, months afterward, to tell me that reading my story had given them the courage to finally have their own longtime attorney review their existing paperwork more carefully, and in at least 2 cases, that careful review had uncovered problems they might otherwise never have caught until it was far too late. Knowing that my own painful experience had rippled outward in that way, protecting people I would never meet, gave the whole ordeal a kind of meaning I hadn't expected to find in the middle of my own grief and anger. Numbers, worth sitting with. About a year after the sentencing, I was invited to speak at a community forum organized by a regional council on aging, held in a conference room at the Kearney Public Library in front of an audience of social workers, elder law attorneys, and ordinary families concerned about protecting older relatives from exactly the kind of exploitation I'd lived through. I had never been comfortable speaking in front of groups, having spent my whole career talking mostly to farmers and their livestock, but I accepted, believing my experience might help someone else recognize the warning signs before it was too late. Before my own remarks, a representative from a national elder justice organization presented data that left me genuinely shaken, even having already lived through my own version of what those numbers represented. She explained that financial exploitation of older adults remains one of the most underreported crimes in the country, with a significant portion of documented cases involving a family member rather than a stranger, precisely because family relationships create both the access and the emotional cover that make this kind of scheme so difficult to detect and even harder to report once it's suspected. She also described the specific vulnerability of estate planning documents, explaining that undue influence in will and power of attorney signings is one of the fastest growing categories of elder financial exploitation nationally, precisely because so many family members mistakenly believe that helping an elderly relative handle the paperwork is simply an act of loving assistance rather than a potential opportunity for manipulation. When it came my turn to speak, my voice shook only at the start, growing steadier as I went, and I closed with a line that a local paper later quoted in its coverage of the event. If someone offers to drive you 2 hours to a lawyer you've never met and insists on doing all the talking once you get there, ask yourself why your own longtime attorney isn't good enough for whatever they're proposing. And if a lawyer ever asks to speak with you alone, don't be embarrassed. Be grateful. That request just might be the thing that saves everything you've worked your whole life to build. After the forum, several people approached me, some to share their own family's ongoing struggles with a relative suspected of similar behavior, others simply to thank me for putting words to a pain so many rural families carry in complete isolation, hidden behind the same shame and family loyalty that had almost let Denise's scheme succeed entirely. Extended family ways. And news of the charges against Denise didn't stay contained within our immediate household for long, and I found myself, in the weeks following the arraignment, having to field questions and reactions from a wider circle of relatives, most of whom hadn't spoken to me directly in years, some of whom I hadn't seen since Ruth's funeral. My cousin Gerald, who lives out near Omaha and with whom I've never been especially close, called me out of the blue one evening, having heard about the case through a relative who'd seen the newspaper article shared online. "Arthur," he said, his voice carrying an awkward mixture of concern and something almost like judgment, "I can't believe you're actually pursuing charges against your own niece. Family's family. Couldn't you have just handled this quietly, kept it between yourselves?" I explained to him, as patiently as I could manage, everything that had led to this decision. The bank's documented note from March, Attorney Combs's account of the meeting in May, the pattern Detective Sandoval had uncovered across other cases in the region. But I could tell my explanation didn't fully satisfy whatever discomfort he felt about a family matter becoming a matter of public record and criminal prosecution. A cousin on Ruth's side of the family, by contrast, wrote me a long, heartfelt letter expressing nothing but support, sharing her own story of a nephew who had exploited an elderly aunt's trust years earlier, a situation the family had chosen to handle quietly, resulting, she wrote, in that nephew going on to attempt similar schemes against 2 other relatives in subsequent years, since no formal consequence had ever been attached to his first betrayal. Those 2 very different reactions from my own extended family taught me something important about how differently people can view the same fundamental choice. Whether protecting family privacy matters more than protecting the next potential victim from a pattern of behavior left unaddressed. I came to believe, more firmly with each passing month, that silence in these situations rarely protects anyone for long, and that accountability, however uncomfortable it makes distant relatives feel from the safety of a phone call, is usually the only thing standing between one betrayal and the next. A letter to Ruth. There's a habit I've picked back up since all of this happened, one I'd let slip in the first few years of my widowhood when the grief was too heavy to find the right words for. Writing letters to Ruth. Letters I'll never mail to any address, but that I keep folded in a small cedar box on the dresser in our old bedroom, beside a photograph from our wedding day. In the first letter I wrote after the sentencing, I tried to tell her everything that had happened, as though she might somehow read it from wherever she is now, in that place I've always quietly believed our loved ones go, without ever making too much fuss about that belief out loud. Ruth, I wrote that evening, my hand a little unsteady on the page. You asked me near the end to keep Denise and Danny close, to make sure they never drifted away from us. I don't know if what happened counts as keeping that promise the way you meant it, but I made sure Denise faced the truth of what she tried to do, out loud, in front of people who wouldn't let her talk her way around it. I hope that counts for something, even if it doesn't look the way either of us would have wanted it to look. I told her about Danny, about how he'd held himself together with a steadiness that reminded me so much of his father, my brother Ray, and about Walt, whose steady friendship through all of this had become something I'm not sure I could have gotten through the last year without. I told her about the farmhouse, still standing, the same kitchen table where all of this began, now the site of countless ordinary Sunday dinners with Danny whenever he passes through town. I don't know if Ruth can truly read these letters from wherever she is now, beyond whatever the eye can see, but writing them gives me a peace I haven't found anywhere else, the quiet certainty that, despite everything I've been through this past year, I haven't broken the promise I made to her in those final days. The promise to keep this family, imperfect and wounded as it now is, from falling apart entirely. The pressure to drop it. There's an episode I haven't mentioned yet, one that happened in the weeks between filing the police report and the preliminary hearing when the investigation was still in a delicate early stage and family tensions had reached their most painful point. One evening, Denise's mother-in-law, a woman I'd met only a handful of times at family gatherings over the years, since Denise had married relatively young and her husband's family lived a good distance away, showed up unannounced at my farmhouse, having heard about the charges through Denise's husband. "Mr. Kessler," she said, her voice tight with a mix of worry and desperation, "please, think about what a conviction like this could do to Denise's marriage, to her whole future. She's already lost her business. Does she have to lose everything else too?" I stood on my own porch, feeling the weight of that plea pressed down on me, aware that behind those words was a genuine, understandable fear for a young woman's future, even from someone who barely knew the full extent of what Denise had actually attempted. "I understand your concern for her," I told her, with a steadiness that cost me more than I let show, "and I want you to know that no part of me wants to see Denise's whole life defined by this one terrible decision. But I can't withdraw a report based on documented facts, a bank record, an attorney's sworn statement, her own admission at my own kitchen table. If I did, I wouldn't just be betraying the promise I made to Ruth. I'd be teaching Denise that deception and attempted theft can be made to disappear if enough people plead hard enough about the consequences." I called Louise Bergman that same evening to tell her about the visit, and she reassured me that my response had been exactly right, both legally and morally, reminding me that emotional pressure, however understandable on a human level, should never be allowed to override a decision grounded in documented, verified facts. But that night, thinking about the desperation in that woman's voice, I slept worse than I had in the weeks before, aware that whatever path I chose, pain for this family had already become unavoidable. My church community. Throughout this entire ordeal, I found an unexpected source of steady support from the same small Lutheran congregation Ruth and I had attended for our entire married life, the church where we'd married and where, years later, we'd held Ruth's funeral service. Pastor James Holloway, who had taken over the congregation only a few years before Ruth passed, came to visit me not long after the story became public knowledge, sitting with me at my kitchen table over coffee, listening without judgment as I explained everything that had happened. "Arthur," he told me, "there's no verse in Scripture that tells you to protect a wrongdoer from the consequences of their actions in the name of family loyalty. Accountability and love aren't opposites. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is refuse to let someone's harmful choices go unaddressed." His words gave me a kind of moral clarity I hadn't fully found on my own, especially during the weeks when Denise's mother-in-law had shown up pleading with me to drop the charges, when the emotional pressure to simply let the matter disappear had felt almost overwhelming. Pastor Holloway continued checking in with me regularly throughout the investigation and the trial, sometimes simply sitting with me in comfortable silence when words felt insufficient for what I was going through. Several members of the congregation, people I'd known for decades but never discussed anything this personal with, reached out in their own quiet ways. A casserole left on my porch, a handwritten card slipped into my mailbox, an offer to drive me to the courthouse on days when Walt had prior commitments of his own. That quiet, steady support from a community I'd been part of my entire adult life reminded me that even in the loneliest, most painful moments of a family betrayal, we rarely have to walk through it entirely alone, provided we're willing to let the people around us actually see what we're carrying. When I finally returned to regular Sunday services, several months after the sentencing, Pastor Holloway offered a prayer during the service, without naming me directly, for families finding the courage to face hard truths together. And I sat in my usual pew, the same one Ruth and I had shared for over 4 decades, feeling, for the first time in a long while, that I wasn't navigating this grief entirely on my own, a scare of my own. There was a stretch right in the middle of the most intense part of the investigation, when my doctor told me flatly that I needed to slow down for my own health's sake, and that warning taught me, more than almost anything else in this whole ordeal, just how much stress this experience had placed on a body already carrying the weight of Ruth's loss 9 years earlier. One morning, while sitting in Louise Bergman's office going over paperwork related to the upcoming trial, I felt a sudden, sharp tightness in my chest, accompanied by a wave of dizziness that made me grip the edge of her desk to keep from sliding out of my chair. I was rushed to the emergency room at CHI Health Good Samaritan in Kearney, where doctors, after a battery of tests, reassured me it hadn't been a heart attack, but rather a stress-induced cardiac episode, compounded by blood pressure that had been climbing steadily for months under the emotional weight of everything happening in my family. I spent that night, and several more in the weeks that followed, under medical observation, with Danny driving in from wherever his current route had taken him, and Walt checking on the farmhouse and the animals every single day, both of them terrified that after losing Ruth 9 years earlier, they might now lose me too, before the case against Denise had even reached its conclusion. "You can't quit now, Uncle Arthur," Danny told me one evening, gripping my hand with a strength that surprised me. "We've come too far, and whatever happens with Denise, I need you here, healthy, for whatever comes next for this family." Those words, spoken with a quiet fierceness I hadn't heard from Danny in years, gave me a renewed determination to pace myself more carefully through the weeks that followed. With medication prescribed by my cardiologist and a guided relaxation program a counselor recommended I try, I gradually recovered over the following couple of months, though my cardiologist warned me candidly that I'd need to learn, for the rest of my life, to manage emotional stress more carefully than I ever had before, especially given my age and the grief that had already been weighing on my heart long before this whole ordeal with Denise ever began. What the conviction cost. Denise. I want to take a moment to be honest about the full weight of consequences Denise faced, beyond what the court itself imposed, because understanding the complete scope of what her choices cost her helps make clear just how seriously her own community and her professional standing ultimately treated what she'd attempted. Denise's landlord for the boutique space, upon learning of the criminal charges through the local news coverage, declined to renew her lease even before the business's financial troubles forced the closure on their own, effectively ending the store several months earlier than she might have managed otherwise. Several of her longtime customers in Grand Island, people who had shopped at her store for years, stopped coming in once word of the charges spread through the small business community there, a consequence that had nothing directly to do with the criminal case itself, but that Denise told Danny had been one of the more humbling experiences of the entire ordeal, watching relationships she'd built over years evaporate almost overnight. Her marriage, too, strained considerably under the weight of the revelations, with her husband initially unaware of the full extent of her financial troubles, or her attempt to gain control over my estate. According to what Danny told me, the couple spent several months in marriage counseling, working through the breach of trust her secrecy had caused within their own household, separate entirely from whatever reconciliation might eventually be possible with me. Financially, the mandatory financial counseling, combined with restitution, owed to her mother-in-law for the earlier undisclosed loan and the collapse of her business, left Denise considerably further behind than she'd been even at her lowest point before this whole scheme began, delaying any hope of financial stability by what her own counselor estimated to be several additional years of careful, disciplined rebuilding. I won't pretend I take any satisfaction in watching Denise's personal and professional life become so much harder because of her own choices. But I do believe, having watched this unfold, that consequences proportional to the harm attempted are a necessary part of any real path toward change, and that someone who skips past those consequences too easily rarely learns the lesson deeply enough to avoid repeating some version of the same mistake later in life. Denise's path. Forward. About a year after the sentencing, once Denise had completed the first phase of her court-mandated financial counseling and found stable work managing a retail store in Grand Island after closing her own boutique for good, she asked, through Danny, whether I'd be willing to meet her for coffee somewhere neutral, away from both the farmhouse and any legal proceedings still hanging over both our heads. I agreed, though not without a good deal of soul-searching first, talking it through carefully with both Walt and Louise Bergman before deciding I was ready. I found her changed in ways that surprised me, quieter, more guarded, with none of the easy confidence she'd always carried, but with something else in its place that looked cautiously like genuine humility. "Uncle Arthur," she said, her voice careful, "I know there's nothing I can say that makes what I did okay. I'm not here to ask you to forget it or pretend it didn't happen. I just wanted you to know that I've been in counseling, I've closed the store, I'm working an honest job now, and for the first time in almost 3 years, I'm not lying awake at night trying to figure out how to hide my debts from everyone I love. I know that doesn't undo anything. I just wanted you to hear it from me." I sat with that for a long moment, studying the young woman across from me, remembering the little girl who used to ride shotgun in my veterinary truck, asking 100 questions about every animal we visited. "Denise," I said finally, "I believe that you mean that today. What I need to see, over time, not just words, is whether that commitment holds when things get hard again, because desperation doesn't disappear just because someone finally says the right things out loud." I told her, as honestly as I could, that whatever relationship we managed to rebuild, if any, would depend entirely on years of consistent, demonstrated honesty, not on a single tearful conversation over coffee, no matter how sincere it felt in the moment. She nodded, accepting that condition without argument, and for the first time since this whole ordeal began, I allowed myself a small, cautious hope that some version of my niece, the one Ruth had spent her whole life helping shape, might still find her way back to the values she had worked so hard to instill in her. An unsettling precedent. During the deeper stages of Detective Sandoval's investigation, a detail surfaced that added another uncomfortable layer to this whole story, suggesting Denise's troubles with money and honesty went back further than either Danny or I had ever realized. Detective Sandoval, with the proper authorization, uncovered that roughly 2 years earlier, while her boutique's early struggles were already becoming apparent, though not yet critical, Denise had asked her own mother-in-law directly for a loan of several $1,000s, claiming it was needed to cover unexpected inventory costs so she could keep the store fully stocked through a slow season. According to records investigators were able to piece together, that loan was never fully repaid, and Denise had continued making small partial payments toward it long after the original due date, apparently hoping to avoid confronting the growing scope of her financial troubles, even with her own husband's family. This precedent, Detective Sandoval told me, suggests that your niece's financial difficulties, and her pattern of hiding those difficulties rather than confronting them honestly, developed gradually over a longer period than the timeline connected directly to you. This makes it more likely that the scheme targeting your estate wasn't an isolated decision, but the escalation of a pattern she'd already been living with quietly for years. That discovery affected me more deeply than I expected, because it meant that Denise's difficulty with honesty about money predated even her earliest visits to my bank, suggesting a slow, steady erosion of judgment that had been building for years before I ever became aware of any danger to my own finances. I reached out as gently as I could manage to Denise herself to share this discovery, not to pile on additional shame, but to help her understand just how long her financial struggles had been, quietly eroding her own honesty, well before I myself ever became fully aware of the danger. Denise broke down when I told her about that earlier loan from her mother-in-law, admitting she'd never fully grasped just how much time had passed since her own judgment had first begun slipping, one small compromise at a time, until it led her to a lawyer's office in Grand Island and a set of documents I never should have come close to signing. Another voice. From the gallery. During the trial, alongside Attorney Combs' own testimony, Assistant County Attorney Castellano, also called Delbert Krause, the elderly widower from Lexington, whose own case Detective Sandoval had shared with me in confidence months earlier, to testify about his own experience with a family betrayal involving legal paperwork, offering the jury a broader context for understanding just how systematic and damaging this kind of exploitation can become across families that never expect it. Delbert, walking slowly with the assistance of a cane, described to the jury how his own nephew had convinced him to sign what he'd been told was a simple tax document, only to discover nearly a year later that he had permanently transferred a significant portion of his farmland, land that had been in his family for 3 generations, without ever fully understanding what he was signing at the time. "I want you to understand something," Delbert told the jury, his voice steady despite his obvious age and the visible effort it cost him to speak at length. "Mr. Kessler here was fortunate. He had a lawyer sharp enough to catch what was happening before anything got signed. I didn't have that same luck, and to this day, that land is gone, recorded permanently under someone else's name at the county courthouse. What almost happened to Mr. Kessler is the same kind of betrayal that actually happened to me. He just had someone paying close enough attention to stop it in time." Hearing Delbert's testimony from the gallery, I felt a complicated mixture of gratitude and grief. Gratitude for the professional vigilance that had allowed my own case to be caught before any real damage occurred, and grief for a man sitting just a few rows away from me who had never received the same measure of protection for an identical kind of betrayal. After the trial concluded, Delbert and I struck up a friendship of our own, 2 men who had lived through nearly the same kind of family scheme, but with very different outcomes, united now by a shared determination to speak publicly about a pattern of exploitation that too many older adults across rural communities continue to face in complete isolation. Expert voices in the courtroom. During the trial, alongside Attorney Combs' own testimony about the warning signs of undue influence, the prosecution called a geriatric social worker to explain to the jury exactly how this particular kind of manipulation typically unfolds. Testimony I found unexpectedly clarifying. Even having lived through the situation firsthand, the expert, a careful, soft-spoken woman named Dr. Ellen Marsh, explained that what specialists call undue influence in estate planning is especially difficult to prevent, precisely because it rarely announces itself as coercion. It tends to arrive wrapped in genuine-seeming affection, helpfulness, and apparent concern for the older adult's convenience, making it nearly invisible to the victim until, as in my case, an outside professional happens to recognize the pattern. This is precisely why cases like Mr. Kessler's so often involve family members with close, trusted access, Dr. Marsh told the jury, rather than outside con artists who have no real relationship with the victim at all. Trust is precisely what makes this kind of manipulation possible, and trust is exactly what makes it so painful and so difficult to prosecute, since so many victims are reluctant to believe someone they love could be capable of it, even once the evidence becomes undeniable. She went on to describe, with the jury's careful attention, a handful of similar cases she'd consulted on across the state in recent years, cases that almost always followed the same basic pattern: an older adult grateful for help with confusing paperwork, a younger relative already under some form of financial pressure, and a document that expanded, quietly and gradually, far beyond whatever the older adult originally believed they were agreeing to. Listening to that testimony from the gallery, I understood. with a clarity that helped ease some of my private guilt, that my own instincts hadn't been the only factor protecting me. Attorney Combs's professional training, honed through years of watching for exactly this pattern, had been the thing that finally broke through months of careful deception. A reminder that even a stranger, if properly trained to notice the right signs, can sometimes serve as the last line of defense for people who trust too easily and too completely. The seasons on the farm. There are moments in these quiet evenings over the past year when I simply sit on my own porch and watch the light change over the 11 acres Ruth and I bought together more than 5 decades ago. Thinking about how many seasons I've watched pass from this exact spot, how many Nebraska winters have buried this land in snowdrifts taller than a man, how many summers have brought that same thick, dry heat that used to make my old veterinary truck feel like an oven by mid-afternoon. Fall, in particular, remains my favorite season out here, with the cottonwoods along the creek turning that pale gold before the leaves finally let go, and the air carrying that particular crispness that always used to mean calving season was approaching. It was on one of those crisp fall evenings, almost exactly a year after the sentencing, that I found myself walking the fence line with Walt, checking a section that needed repair, when we ran into Detective Sandoval, off duty that evening, out for a drive with his own family along the county road that runs past my property. We stopped to talk for a few minutes, more like old acquaintances now than victim and investigating officer on a closed case, and he said something that has stayed with me since. "Mr. Kessler," he told me, "in 15 years on the force, I've seen a lot of family fraud cases, but I don't see many people handle it with the kind of steady, methodical dignity you brought to this one, treating it like a set of facts to be documented and verified instead of letting rage or shame take over. That says a great deal about who you actually are, far more than your niece ever understood when she assumed you'd never notice what she was trying to do." His words stayed with me the rest of that walk home, as I thought about how much my life had changed since the beginning of this ordeal, and how, despite the pain still present from Denise's betrayal, I felt in some fundamental way stronger than before, more aware of the real value of what Ruth and I had built together across a lifetime of careful, honest work, out here on this same quiet stretch of Nebraska farmland. Attorney Combs's own recognition. A few months after the trial concluded, the Nebraska State Bar Association's Elder Law Section invited Attorney Combs to speak at a continuing education seminar for other estate planning attorneys using my case, with my full permission and Louise Bergman's encouragement, as an example of best practices for identifying undue influence during client meetings. He invited me to attend, and though I felt strange sitting in a room full of lawyers discussing my own personal ordeal in careful, professional language, I came away from that seminar with a new appreciation for just how much depended on Attorney Combs's specific training and instincts that day in his office. Several attorneys in attendance shared their own stories of cases where they hadn't caught the warning signs in time, where a client had gone on to sign documents that later proved devastating precisely because nobody in the room had thought to ask for a private conversation before the ink dried. What Mr. Kessler's case demonstrates, Attorney Combs told the room, is that a single question, asking to speak with the client alone, can be the entire difference between protecting someone and failing them completely. It costs nothing, it takes only a few minutes, and it should be standard practice in every single estate planning meeting involving an older client and an accompanying family member, regardless of how confident or reasonable that family member's explanations might sound. Following that seminar, several attorneys in the room told me privately that they intended to make that private conversation a mandatory part of their own office's intake procedures going forward, a small but meaningful change that, Attorney Combs told me later, had already begun spreading through several practices across central Nebraska. Knowing that my own case had contributed in some concrete way to changing professional practice for attorneys I would never personally meet gave me a sense of purpose that helped balance out some of the lingering grief from everything Denise's betrayal had cost our family. You turn something painful into something genuinely useful for a lot of families who'll never even know your name, Attorney Combs told me at the end of that seminar, and that's not something everyone manages to do after going through what you went through. An old vet's advice. If there's one thing I'd want every person my age, every widower or widow, handing over important paperwork to a younger relative out of gratitude for their help, to take away from this story, It's this: never let anyone else schedule your legal appointments, do your talking for you, or drive you somewhere you've never been to see a professional you've never met before. For 41 years, I learned to trust my own careful observation over comfortable assumptions when it came to the animals in my care, and yet I let that same discipline slip the one time it mattered most, in a stranger's office, with my own niece answering questions on my behalf, simply because gratitude and love made me want to trust her completely. I've also learned that real family isn't measured only by blood, but by who actually shows up to protect you when it matters most. Walt wasn't my relative, and yet he was the first person to raise a concern, recognizing in Denise's insistence the same pattern that had nearly cost his own wife's family their land decades earlier. Denise was practically a daughter to Ruth and me, raised at our own kitchen table, and yet she chose, when desperation came calling, to exploit the very trust I'd given her so freely. That contrast has taught me to look past the formal ties of family, toward the people who actually demonstrate, through their concrete actions, that they deserve renewed trust. And finally, I've learned that recognizing a hidden financial crisis in a family member, however painful the criminal consequences that follow from it, doesn't have to mean condemning that person completely as a human being. Denise committed a serious crime against me, one I won't ever fully forget. But she also deserves, like anyone struggling with genuine shame and desperation, the chance to rebuild, provided that rebuilding moves forward alongside full accountability, not as a substitute for it. Holding both of those truths at once, the seriousness of what she did and her continued worth as a human being capable of change, has been the hardest and most necessary lesson of this entire ordeal. The Widower from Lexington. In the time since the trial concluded, I sought out and eventually met the elderly widower from Lexington, whose case Detective Sandoval had mentioned to me months earlier. A man named Delbert Krause, who had lost permanent control of his farmhouse and surrounding acreage after signing a quitclaim deed he never fully understood, believing it to be a temporary tax arrangement rather than an irreversible transfer of ownership. We met for the first time at a small diner off Highway 30. Two old men comparing notes on a betrayal that neither of us ever imagined we'd have in common. Delbert, unlike me, never received any restitution, and the property itself remained legally transferred, since the deed had been properly executed and recorded before anyone in his family realized the true scope of what had happened. "You got what I never did, Arthur," he told me once, over coffee, without any resentment in his voice, only a kind of tired honesty. A lawyer who caught the problem before you signed, a jury that actually heard the whole truth, a judge who ordered real consequences. I got a deed that's already recorded at the county courthouse, and a family relationship that's never been the same since. I've tried, in whatever small ways I can, to help Delbert understand what limited legal options might still exist for him, using what little knowledge I've accumulated from my own case. Though Louise Bergman was honest with both of us that his situation, once the deed was recorded, offered far fewer paths toward any kind of correction. Together, Delbert and I started attending the same community forums and elder advocacy meetings, sharing our two very different outcomes from what was, at its core, a remarkably similar family betrayal, hoping that hearing both versions, mine, which was caught in time, and his, which wasn't, might help other families understand both what's possible when the right safeguards happen to be in place, and how permanently things can go wrong when they aren't. Delbert has become, in his own quiet way, another piece of the unexpected community this whole ordeal built around me, alongside Walt, alongside Pastor Holloway, alongside Detective Sandoval himself, all of us bound together now by a shared commitment to making sure fewer families have to walk this particular road entirely alone. The farmhouse. Today. I'm writing this part of the story on a cold evening, almost 2 years now, since that morning Denise drove me to Grand Island to meet a lawyer I'd never heard of before. The farmhouse is still mine. The original will Louise Bergman drew up decades ago remains fully intact and unchanged, splitting my estate evenly between Danny and the Kearney Area Humane Society's Memorial Fund. Since Denise's probationary terms now formally exclude her as a beneficiary, unless I choose, freely and on my own, to reinstate her someday. I'm 80 years old now, and my hands, marked by decades of veterinary work, shake a little more than they used to, but my eyes, and more importantly my judgment, remain sharp enough to recognize the subtle warning signs of a family betrayal before it can grow into something even more devastating. Denise continues working steadily at the retail store in Grand Island, and according to what Danny tells me during his visits, she's kept up with her financial counseling requirements without a single missed session. She hasn't yet asked to visit the farmhouse on a regular basis, and I haven't yet invited her to, though we've had 3 more coffee meetings since that first one, each a little easier than the last, each still carrying the careful, watchful distance I know will take years, not months, to fully close. Danny stops by every time his trucking route brings him anywhere near Kearney, sometimes staying a night or two, helping me with whatever needs fixing around the property, continuing the tradition his own father, my brother Ray, started decades ago of treating this farmhouse as a second home, rather than simply a relative's property to visit occasionally. Walt still joins me for coffee on my porch most mornings, the weather allows, and, in certain quiet moments, watching him tell some old story about the county fair, or listening to him complain good-naturedly about the price of feed corn, I've come to realize that the loneliness I feared after Ruth passed has become, without my quite noticing when it happened, a little lighter than it once was. Not replaced by what I lost, but eased by an unexpected steadiness in a friendship that this whole ordeal taught me never to take for granted again. The old veterinary bag. There was a project, during the hardest months of this whole ordeal, that gave me a kind of comfort I hadn't expected to find. Restoring my father's old veterinary bag, a leather satchel he'd carried on his own rounds decades before I ever took up the profession myself, its stitching frayed and its brass buckles tarnished, after sitting untouched in the back of my barn for longer than I cared to admit. I took up that project in the weeks right after the investigation began, almost as a way to keep my hands occupied, while my mind wrestled with something too painful to face head-on for very long at a time. I spent evenings carefully cleaning the leather with the same conditioning oil I remembered my father using, reinforcing the loosened stitching thread by thread, polishing the brass hardware until it caught the light again the way it must have decades earlier, working with the same patient precision I'd once applied to setting a broken bone in a distressed animal. There was something deeply symbolic, I realized only toward the end of that project, in devoting myself to restoring something old and neglected, precisely while my own family life seemed to be falling apart around me. Every stitch I carefully repaired, every buckle I polished back to a shine, gave me back a small piece of the control and dignity that Denise's betrayal had so thoroughly shaken. When I finally finished restoring that bag, after weeks of careful, patient work, I felt a satisfaction I hadn't experienced in longer than I could remember. A satisfaction that reminded me exactly why I'd devoted 41 years of my life to this work in the first place. Not for the money, and certainly not for any recognition, but for the deep, quiet satisfaction of restoring health and dignity to creatures who couldn't speak for themselves. Exactly the same instinct that had, in its own way, protected me when I couldn't quite speak up for myself in Attorney Combs' office. Today that bag sits on a shelf in my study, right next to a framed photograph of Ruth, and every time I look at it, I think about how patience and careful attention can restore dignity even to what seemed hopelessly lost. Exactly the way that same patience and attention eventually restored the truth about my estate, protected by the very kind of professional vigilance I'd spent a lifetime learning to respect in my own veterinary practice. A portrait of an old vet. A few months ago, a young photographer from the University of Nebraska at Kearney, a student named Caleb Rourke, who had heard my story through a mutual friend and was himself working through the aftermath of an aunt's financial betrayal involving a small family inheritance, asked if he could photograph me and the objects that mattered most from my life as part of a photography project on resilience within rural families. He spent several weeks photographing me at different times of day, sitting on the front porch as the morning light came through the cottonwoods, standing in the old barn beside my restored veterinary bag, at the kitchen table, going over paperwork with Louise Bergman's latest confirmation letter spread out in front of me, the framed photograph of Ruth visible just behind my shoulder in several of the shots. When he showed me the finished collection, during a small gathering he arranged with Walt and Danny present, I found myself unexpectedly moved. The photographs told a story without a single word of narration, a life built on careful, patient attention to detail, tested by a betrayal that could have broken that discipline entirely, but instead had only deepened my commitment to it. I wanted to capture more than just you, Caleb told me, handing over a printed copy of the collection. I wanted to capture the idea that paying close attention to the people and the paperwork in our lives isn't just a habit. It's a form of protection, and sometimes even a form of love, for the people who come after us. Those photographs now hang in a small frame in my front hallway, the first thing any visitor sees when they walk through my door. A quiet, permanent reminder of what patient honesty can accomplish even in the face of the most painful betrayal by someone we trusted completely. Caleb told me he'd wanted to create this project not just for me, but for every family in rural Nebraska quietly carrying the weight of a similar betrayal, hidden behind pride and the shame of admitting that someone they loved had chosen to deceive them, a shame that too often keeps these stories buried instead of shared as warnings that might protect the next family from the same painful discovery. The first Thanksgiving. After the truth, the first Thanksgiving after the trial concluded carried a mixture of feelings for our whole family, the first holiday we could finally sit with the truth of what had happened out in the open, without the weight of an unresolved investigation still hanging over every conversation. In the days leading up to the holiday, I found myself going through the box of decorations Ruth had always kept carefully organized in the hall closet, each item carrying its own small memory she used to love, recounting every single year. The ceramic turkey Denise made in elementary school, still displayed proudly on the sideboard every November since. The same wool blanket we'd used at every Thanksgiving football game we ever attended together as a family, worn soft from decades of use. I hosted dinner at the farmhouse, exactly as Ruth always had, inviting Danny, Walt, who I'd come to consider practically part of the family by that point, and Detective Sandoval, along with his own wife and children, as a small gesture of gratitude for the diligence that had made this whole difficult process of accountability possible in the first place. Denise wasn't at that first Thanksgiving. We all agreed, without much discussion, that it was still too soon, but Danny brought a card from her, a short handwritten note thanking me for not giving up on her while holding her fully accountable. I read it quietly to myself before dinner, then placed it carefully in the same cedar box where I keep my letters to Ruth, a small but real sign of the slow, uncertain progress this family was still working to make. During dinner, I raised a glass in Ruth's memory, thanking her silently for the patience and honesty she'd instilled in this family across decades, values that had ultimately protected us, even through the most painful betrayal any of us could have imagined coming from someone we loved so completely. Danny, sitting beside me, squeezed my hand in a quiet, wordless gesture of gratitude and shared grief, and for the first time in over a year, I felt something close to genuine peace settle over that table, despite the empty chair we all still noticed in our own separate ways throughout the meal. What I've learned, looking back on everything I've been through from that first Sunday conversation about getting my paperwork in order to this evening, sitting here with the restored veterinary bag resting on its shelf across the room, there are a few simple truths I now carry more deeply than any diagnostic principle I ever learned across 41 years of professional practice. First is that no legal arrangement, however reasonable and well-intentioned it might sound, should ever be signed without independent review from someone who represents only your own interests, not the interests of whoever suggested the arrangement in the first place. I let Denise schedule an appointment with a stranger, drive me 2 hours to his office, and answer nearly every question on my behalf, without ever once insisting that my own longtime attorney at least look over whatever was being proposed first. The second truth is that professional vigilance, the kind Attorney Combs demonstrated when he asked to speak with me alone, can be the single most important safeguard an older adult has against exactly this kind of manipulation. It was his willingness to recognize the warning signs and insist on a private conversation that ultimately exposed a truth Denise had hoped would stay hidden behind her carefully maintained confidence. The third truth, perhaps the hardest one to accept, is that the deepest betrayals rarely come from strangers. They come from the people who've ridden along in our own trucks for years, who call us uncle with the same voice they use to quietly attempt to take everything we've built without our full understanding or consent. And finally, the fourth truth, perhaps the most important of all, justice, however slow and however painful its process might feel, can eventually arrive, provided we have the courage to verify what our instincts are telling us, instead of accepting comforting reassurances at face value, provided we find at least one professional or one friend willing to notice what we might have missed on our own, and provided we hold on to the same careful, patient documentation that protected the truth of this whole story from being lost. Exactly the same discipline I spent 41 years applying to sick animals that, until this past year, I never imagined I'd need to apply to my own family. The weeks before I bring this story to its final conclusions, I want to return, one more time, to the weeks leading up to that Sunday conversation about getting my paperwork in order, because there's a detail I've saved for the end, one that still gives me a small chill whenever I think back on it now. In the weeks before that conversation, Denise had started visiting more often than usual, asking careful questions about exactly what my original will said, whether I still had the deed to the farmhouse in a safe place, whether Louise Bergman still had my most recent paperwork on file. Questions that, at the time, I interpreted as ordinary concern for an aging uncle, the kind of casual interest a caring niece might naturally take in making sure everything was in order. Looking back now, with the clarity that only comes after the fact, I recognize those conversations for what they likely were: careful reconnaissance, gathering exactly the information she'd need to make her eventual proposal sound not just helpful, but almost inevitable, a natural extension of an interest she'd already been quietly cultivating for weeks. I think often about how thin the line is between genuine affection and calculated manipulation, how similar they can look from the outside, especially when the person involved continues to show every other sign of authentic care in the majority of their daily interactions with us. There's no simple formula for telling the difference, no single foolproof signal that guarantees certainty. There's only constant attention to detail, the willingness to never assume that apparent kindness automatically rules out hidden, troubling motives, and above all, the wisdom to always involve an independent professional before accepting significant legal paperwork as final, no matter how much we trust the person who arranged it. Those weeks, the last ones before the trip to Grand Island took full shape, I lived through with an ordinary, unsuspecting calm that hid, without my awareness, the quiet planning already taking place beneath the surface, a plan that would only reveal its true nature months later, in a lawyer's office, once the door had closed behind my own niece. A word for anyone doubting themselves. I want to spend one more moment speaking directly to anyone listening to this story who recognizes, in their own life, that same painful feeling of having nearly signed something important without fully understanding it, of feeling foolish now for trusting someone who turned out to be willing to betray that trust. In the weeks after I first understood what Denise had been trying to do, I asked myself over and over whether I was somehow to blame for this, for not insisting on Louise Bergman's involvement from the very beginning, for trusting my own niece so completely that I never thought to question a 2-hour drive to an unfamiliar office. That guilt, I've come to understand over time, is understandable but ultimately misplaced. The responsibility for a betrayal always belongs to the person who attempts it, not to the person who, in good faith, extended trust to someone who should have deserved it. But there's a valuable lesson buried in all of this too, one I want to share with anyone facing a similar situation. Even when trust is nearly betrayed, not everything is lost if the right safeguards happen to be in place, or if we have the determination to verify the facts carefully, once our instincts finally catch up to what's happening. Attorney Combs's professional training, which I couldn't have anticipated when I sat down across from him that morning, became exactly the safeguard that protected me the moment it mattered most. The message I'd want to leave with anyone facing a similar offer from a family member, someone eager to handle your legal paperwork, your banking, your estate planning, to make things easier, is this: never be afraid to insist on your own longtime attorney's involvement. Never be afraid to ask detailed questions about exactly what a document says before you sign it. And never let gratitude for someone's help stop you from double-checking exactly what they've arranged on your behalf. Your dignity, the product of a lifetime of careful, honest work, deserves exactly that same level of careful attention, no matter how much you trust the person offering to help. One last image. I close my eyes sometimes, in the evenings, And I still see that Tuesday morning at Attorney Combs's office, the moment he set down his pen and asked Denise, politely but firmly, to step outside. I see the door clicking quietly shut behind her, and the sudden shift in his manner, once we were alone, the careful, direct questions that would ultimately reveal everything I hadn't understood about what I'd almost agreed to sign. I see Walt's face on my porch, weeks before that meeting ever happened, the concern in his eyes that I brushed aside too easily at the time. I see Patricia Yoon sliding her computer screen toward me at the bank, showing me a note from March that I never knew existed, proof that whatever Denise had been planning had started months before she ever mentioned updating my paperwork out loud. I see Louise Bergman's steady, unhurried presence throughout the whole ordeal, the same calm professionalism she'd brought to every piece of legal business Ruth and I had ever needed across 30 years, now guiding me through the hardest chapter our family had ever faced. And I see most of all the moment Denise sat across from me at my own kitchen table, finally admitting the truth about her failing business, about the shame that had driven her toward a betrayal neither of us could have imagined possible just a year earlier. It was in that exact moment, I believe, that I stopped being a man paralyzed by disbelief in his own niece and became once again the veterinarian who'd spent 41 years learning to trust careful observation over comfortable assumptions. A man capable of verifying his own rights, of protecting, with the same patient discipline I'd applied to a lifetime of difficult diagnoses, the dignity and the legacy I'd built together with my wife. The restored veterinary bag still sits on its shelf in my study, a quiet, permanent reminder of what patient attention and the refusal to give up can accomplish, even in the face of the most painful betrayal from someone we love completely. If there's one lesson I hope you carry away from everything I've shared with you today, it's this: never let your age or your love for someone become an excuse for skipping the independent verification that protects everything you've worked your whole life to build. One last thought for you. If you've made it this far, listening to my story all the way through, I want to leave you with something more than just an account of what happened. I want to leave you with a question, the same question I've asked myself every single night since this whole ordeal began. Are you certain that your own estate planning, your own most important legal paperwork, is protected in a way that would survive a determined betrayal from the person you trust most in this world? I'm not asking you to suspect everyone you love, nor am I asking you to turn every family arrangement into a forensic investigation, devoid of any trust in the people around you. I'm simply asking you to never let your trust in someone stop you from verifying, through appropriate and proportionate means, exactly what your instincts are telling you. And if someone close to you offers to drive you somewhere unfamiliar to see a professional you've never met, ask yourself, gently but seriously, why your own longtime advisors aren't good enough for whatever's being proposed. Faith, for me, has never been about grand gestures or long, formal prayers, but about small daily acts of attention and gratitude. Gratitude toward Ruth, who taught me the value of careful, patient diligence applied to every part of our shared life together. Trust in Walt, who raised a concern the very first time something felt off, drawing on a painful family history I didn't even know he carried, and the quiet hope, which I still carry today, that justice can always coexist with compassion, even when the betrayal comes from someone who should have loved us more. If this story has moved you, if it's reminded you of someone you know, an elderly parent or grandparent handling important legal paperwork with the help of a younger relative, a family member who might be hiding a financial struggle of their own, I ask only this: talk to them this week. Ask if their own longtime attorney has actually reviewed whatever's being proposed. And if someone offers to take care of everything regarding their estate with a little too much reassurance and a little too much urgency, encourage them to pause and verify before signing away anything at all. Before we say goodbye. I'm writing these final words sitting at my kitchen table, the same table where Denise first brought up getting my paperwork in order, with the restored veterinary bag resting on its shelf across the room, and the photograph of Ruth watching over everything from the dresser down the hall. I've thought a great deal these past 2 years about how fortunate I was compared to other victims of similar schemes. People like the widower out near Lexington, whose farmhouse transferred permanently through a misunderstood deed, or the countless others who wrote to me after that newspaper article ran, sharing stories that never made it to any courtroom at all. I had an attorney trained well enough to recognize the warning signs, a friend who spoke up from painful personal experience, my own longtime family lawyer who understood exactly which statutes applied, and a detective determined to see the case through to its conclusion. Not everyone has that same combination of good fortune, and that is exactly why I chose to share this story publicly instead of keeping it as a private family matter, protected behind a more comfortable silence. But comfort, I've learned, was never really the guiding star of my life, any more than it was for Ruth before me. We built this life one careful diagnosis at a time, one honestly earned dollar at a time, one carefully protected right at a time, first together, and now, perhaps, one day with Danny, who continues to visit every time his route brings him anywhere near Kearney, determined to keep this family whole despite everything it's endured. If sharing this story helps even one person in one family trust their own instincts instead of letting comforting reassurances talk them out of double-checking something important, then every word I've shared here will have meant something far greater than I, a simple retired veterinarian from Kearney, Nebraska, could ever have imagined when I first sat down to write it. Before you go, if this story touched your heart the way living through it touched mine, I'm going to ask you for one small favor before you close this video. Share this story with someone you know, an older parent or grandparent who lets a younger relative handle their legal paperwork or their estate planning, anyone who hasn't yet learned to insist on independent advice before signing something important. And if this isn't the first story you've heard on this channel, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next ones. True stories of dignity, justice, and courage, told with exactly the respect they deserve. And leave me a comment. Tell me where you listen from, tell me what you thought, and tell me if you too, near or far, have known a story like this one. Maybe a family member who tried to steer an important decision without telling you the whole truth, or a professional who noticed something wrong at exactly the right moment and refused to look away. Before I let you go, one last word. Some details in this story have been fictionalized for the sake of clarity and emotional weight. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental. But the lesson you just heard, the one about always insisting on independent advice before you sign anything important, that part is as real as it gets. As real as the smell of a barn at 5 in the morning, which is where I spent most of my working life. Thank you for staying with me until the very end.